Nous sommes ravis de vous voir en si grand nombre ici avec DHC Art ce soir, qui nous remercions pour cette belle collaboration. And welcome, Jasmina. We're so pleased to have you with us. You know, you have a lot in common with the CCA. We both use our work to make people think. The CCA approaches curatorial practice as a form of research, not only what this practice means with respect to architecture, but also its specific techniques, knowledge, and boundaries with respect to society in general. Like many contemporary artists, we're driven by an urgent curiosity about the roles and responsibilities of our discipline in shaping and potentially reshaping contemporary life. What we produce is a wide-ranging program, both here in Montreal and abroad, that includes exhibitions, publications, and events. Et j'espère que vous serez des nôtres encore dans les prochaines semaines pour 2 événements qui vous provoqueraient certainement vos sens de curiosité. On November 6th, we open Architecture Itself and Other Postmodernist Myths, a major exhibition by Princeton architecture professor Sylvia Lavin, who proposes a counter-reading of postmodern procedures and replaces the myth of the autonomous architect with accounts and fragments of architectural activities. And on November 15th, we welcome Chus Martinez, the director of the Art Institute at the FHNW Academy of Art and Design in Basel, for our Come and Forget lecture series, in which our guests propose a deliberate act of mass amnesia to see what new ideas might emerge from fruitful forgetting. But back to the here and now, tonight, where we are looking forward to everything that you desire and nothing that you fear. Merci encore, Jasmina et DHCA, pour votre présence ici au CCA, pour ce que je suis certaine va être une soirée mémorable. Now, please join me in welcoming Cheryl Sim, the director of DHC Art and a wonderful performance artist in her own right, to introduce Jasmina's talk. Merci.
Wow, merci. Ça, c'est une introduction incroyable. Merci, Cléa, et bonsoir et bienvenue. Je suis directrice générale et aussi commissaire à la Fondation et de la part de Phoebe Greenberg, notre fondatrice et directrice. J'aimerais remercier chaleureusement le Centre canadien d'architecture. Merci beaucoup, Giovanna, pour l'opportunité de co-présenter cette performance-conférence de Jasmina ici. Nous reconnaissons que cet événement a lieu sur les terres historiquement et actuellement habitées par les peuples autochtones. En tant que colons, nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir l'occasion de nous rencontrer ici et nous remercions tous ceux et celles qui ont pris soin de cette terre depuis des milliers d'années. I first met Jasmina here in Montreal in 2014, soon after the close of her exhibition For Our Economy and Culture that inhabited the Slovenian pavilion at the 55th Venice Biennial. Consistently, throughout her practice, she has examined the instrumentalization of art and architecture for the purposes of nation building and state representation. Jasmina's artistic methodology involves deep archival research and collaboration with a variety of specialists, through which she creates sumptuous Gesamtkunstwerks, total works of art, that combine the potencies of installation, sculpture, photography, performance, and film. The overall effect is exemplary of what I like to call politicized sensuousness. It's a kind of stylistically sumptuous proposal that bears socially and politically subversive teeth. Through a critical feminist unpacking of the complex entanglements of art, gender, and state power with a dose of humor and a touch of the absurd, she encourages us to consider the strategies employed in the construction of a nation-state. Her work is rigorous and seductive, and we are very excited that she is sharing it with us here in Montreal. Please welcome Jasmina Cibic.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you to the CCA for inviting me, and thank you to DHC Art and the entire team there. I'm extremely excited to be able to present a new project which is drawn from older works, but it also encompasses a new investigation which brings together my modes of investigation of specific archives and Montreal context. So I wanted to guide you through kind of a selection of thoughts and projects on nation building and soft power. So I will be tracing archival debris of past ideologies, and I will kind of pollinate them with similar desire building structures.
Construire un État, c'est créer un ensemble d'illusions qui confirment et établissent un terrain d'entente pour les citoyennes et les citoyens. L'art de construire un État, comme n'importe quelle autre forme artistique, dissimule les moyens par lesquels on atteint son objectif. Comme tout bon drame, il n'a pas lieu sur scène, mais dans l'esprit du public. Dans son contrat social, Rousseau introduit un être imaginaire, parfait, dont le rôle est d'aider les individus à passer de l'état de nature au contrat social entre les citoyennes et citoyens et l'État. C'est la législatrice qui fait qu'un individu se transforme en un membre de l'État, agissant à la manière d'un magicien qui convainc son public de la vérité d'une illusion mise en scène.
So art and architecture are amongst some of the best framing devices in the servitude of state power, and they're extremely complicit in the creation of political taste, style, and the entirety of the political backdrop. Now, this is one of the images that I drew upon for the install that's happening at the moment at the DHC Art. This is a photograph of the heads of state comprising the non-aligned movement, which inaugurated in Belgrade in 1961. So you can see the politicians, the heads of state, casting kind of shadows onto the art that's covering the floor in the form of a rug. So we're speaking about the architecture of actualization of nation state, where art and architecture serve as methods of soft power in implementing monumentality, recognizability, and nationality. So we will be looking at archival traces of grandiose statements amongst Expo, sort of World Trade organizational exports and presentations, mostly surrounding the 20th century construct of modernity. So this is the photograph from the Yugoslav Pavilion at the 1958 Expo, presenting the new Belgrade urbanist plan to the Mexican president. Now, all these images that I'm showing to you today are coming from specific archives. Some are of family archives of architects and artists, most of them from institutional archives in Belgrade and Ljubljana. So with the application to the ideas of natural representation, art and architecture become activated as vitrine, frames and decorative mechanisms that are used by power structures of international politics to conceal or reveal that what is curated as the best or worst that the country has to offer. But the question remains, what do we do with all these structures when the client disappears? So the authority of nation state or a political system that commissioned these works when that is absent. So do these structures, does that art and architecture remain as an only empty pedestal, scenography and framework, or can it be renovated and relaunched? So art and architecture are methods used by nation states throughout history So of course this is nothing new, but what is quite interesting in these case studies is that they are quite close to ourselves today in the contemporary condition. So they're used to reaffirm the scenography of the spectacle of state. So we're speaking about stagecraft. Now the architectures I will present have one thing in common. All of them have been protecting, representing, and framing the authority of the client, the nation state. They're also all cases of architecture which has always performed as a site for political action and as a tool for expression of political thought. So these are buildings that choreograph acts and interactions. By their rearticulation as an isolated element suspended between scenography, prop, and object, they dissect the rituals of the spectacle of state. And a prime example of nation-building trickery is the soft power cultivation that arises with trade and universal expositions, global events where countries gather to showcase technological innovation and national cultures to the world. This is an example of the first coherent architectural plan for national presentation in the territory of former Yugoslavia. This is a plan by an architect called Vinko Glanc, who was not a famous modernist architect. He was the student of Jože Pličnik, a bit more famous Slovenian architect. But what is quite phenomenal with Vinko Glanc is that he was the architect who had to translate. So he was presented with projects that needed visual, aesthetic recategorization for the new Yugoslav state. So this was a plan which was not realized. So 1941, Ljubljana, during Second World War, so hence it only stayed an idea. And I trace archival histories, and what I try to do, as I'm not an architectural historian, I try to then cross-pollinate them with different ideas and materials. So it's kind of like a dance of historical ready-mades, really, and they're kind of reconstructing kind of a wider theater of a Gesamtkunstwerk. And the project surrounding the Glanz Pavilion ended up trying to find the right material for the thought process. So I wanted to work with one of the biggest souvenir producers in the territory of Slovenia, and this is a crystal factory. So the company is called Rogaška, and it's a factory that has been there for centuries, and it was always serving the authority that happened to govern that territory. So it went from, from Austro-Hungarian constructs through Kingdom of Yugoslavia towards the Slovene Republic that we have today. And I traced these pavilions and reconstructed them by using the archive of the crystal factory. So in a way, we had a combination of various real protocolarian gifts, some from 1910s, some from 1950s, and so on. So it's again this kind of dance of ideological decoration. And as I was interested in this play with national representatives through time, I made a historical sweep also through the other Slovenian national icons, not only through the successful ones, but also through the failed ones. Now, Slovenia is extremely known as a birthplace of biospeleology, so this is the study of the organisms that live in caves. And amongst these, mostly beetles and various bugs, which constitute 75% of Slovene endemic species, is a small blind cave beetle that lives only in 5 caves. And it's most numerous in a cave called Hell, and it was discovered in 1937 by a Nazi sympathizer called Oskar Scheibel. And according to Linné taxonomy and its rules, once a name is given, it cannot be changed. So this beetle is called Anophthalmus hitleri, the Hitler bug. And only paradoxically, because of its name, it's now being hunted to extinction by neo-Nazi memorabilia collectors. So these vitrines of national representation became a new habitat for the Hitler bug. Now, tracing national icons and their vitrines brought me back to the architect Glanz, and I was trying to figure out why he was chosen as the architect who was supposed to translate for the new state. And I visited his first government project. Now, this is a villa called Villa Bled, which transformed from an Austro-Hungarian hunting castle with a traditional pitched roof into a modernist palace. Glantz was commissioned by the president, Tito, who wanted to recreate this hunting castle into his summer villa and estate where he would entertain diplomatic guests. Now you have to understand, so this is post-Second World War, so Slovenia is extremely bankrupt, there is no money, yet they managed to find the sources to recreate.
That you succeeded in striking the balance between art and architecture on the interior space where the public may not go. But on that one facade, the building's
I hope I said some interesting things.
Yes, you have. I blame the Greeks. Priceless.
And this project ended up becoming a film where I retraced through personal archives of the architect the debates he had with the Yugoslav diplomacy. It took a form of a fictitious interview between Glantz, the architect, and a journalist. And these archives that I was drawing upon reside within the Slovenian National Assembly. And we were partly using these archives, partly we were using his own family archives, which reside in his granddaughter's damp garage. So you have to understand that we really are looking at histories that are not still fully documented and archived. So when I was invited to represent Slovenia, I really wanted to play the double game, and I really wanted to look at the structures of national representation and ask, what does it mean to represent, and whether it is possible to represent a nation. So I went back to Glantz and his project for the Slovenian Parliament, which is the building you see here. And the last words in the little clip you just saw, where they're debating about the architect's successes in representation, refer to this portal. So as we all know, public architecture sometimes is, and government architecture particularly, less accessible to the public than the private space of your neighbor. And I wanted to play with that, with those notions of exchange. So going through the archives, I managed to excavate not only the words, the rhetoric, and those traces, but also the traces of how this architecture was changing. So from what was realized, you focus on the portal here, this was the initial proposal. And what was so phenomenal was tracing these conversations and the power that was ascribed to the artists and the architect. So the politicians effectively let the artists and architects debate at the same table about the style, about the materials. So it wasn't only the choice of local wood and local stone, but of the best local artists. So here, obviously, we have a great difference between the artworks that are part of the fabric of the building, as you can see with the mosaic in the foyer of the Parliament, and the artworks that just decorate the walls, which every new sort of ministerial assortment can change. So I became quite interested in this art collection and really wanted to understand what it meant, as it's a live collection and it's hanging in the offices of the politicians. So the family archives included these transcripts, and amongst them was a particular focus on a fresco titled "The Fruits of Our Land." And this was a fresco which ended up being the only artwork that was censored. It was to be done by Stupica, one of Slovenia's best local artists, and it was depicting, it was supposed to be depicting children carrying lanterns, fruit sellers, and a marketplace. And the debate that was happening around it and the sort of kind of upheaval about its supposedly political content really culminated in this one session, which I decided to use as a reenacted script for the film. I filmed within the original interior of the building, and this is the only room that has stayed as it was in 1958 when these debates were taking place. The entire building was recently renovated, and a new ceiling was put in, And it was a casseted ceiling that cut the heads off from an entire fresco depicting all the heads of state that Slovenia ever had. And the project in Venice populated this national pavilion that we created with the tactics that Glantz was using in his architectures. So local wood, local stone, the paneling he came up with as a kind of idea of evolving and enveloping these rooms. But instead of the materiality of the, let's say, of the local materials, I decided to go back to the local Hitler bug. And we went a step further. We really wanted to play with the actual exchange, so a real double game with the parliament itself. So we borrowed the paintings that otherwise hang behind the politicians' backs. So it's a live collection, as I said, but I really wanted to use only the paintings that never changed their location. And they were, of course, only of Flora's still lifes. And this is them in situ and how they otherwise look. So on the top left corner, this is the cabinet of the President of the National Assembly, room 119. This is Richard Jakopic, a Slovenian impressionist. 3 vases with flowers is from 1935. Next to it, with a little sink, is the room where we file referendums. We love to file referendums. Underneath, you can see the Office for Post with a quite highly hung artwork by Nikolai Omerza. And we were asking the post office people, saying, why is it so high up? And they just grew tired of changing the picture of the president after each election. So it really was a play with the actual building, with the people there, and we ended up having also a session on the project.
I'm against this composition altogether. And if the committee accepts it, I will write my separate opinion for the record. I could never recommend something like that for such a representative space with a clear conscience. Those who know the artist in question know that he's a serious artist. This work of his can easily be shown at the modern or national galleries, but not in a representative building such as the People's Assembly of our country. Imagine a hall full of MPs and these images on the wall behind them. I won't take that kind of responsibility.
The committee you see here was comprised of 5 members, and when they were debating the Slovenian representation for the Venice Biennial, for the 55th project, the committee stayed in the same form. So also there were 5 committee members that were debating our project. And the man that you saw here was the uncle of the man who was extremely against our project. So the story really had a real kind of, re-evolution of history, and kind of really wanted to play with these structures and just point to the fact that they never change. And the entirety of the Slovenian pavilion was covered with the Hitler bugs. And, this is kind of how ideology works. You don't know you're looking at 1 million of them. And so this is just a detail from the project. So the entire wallpaper is made from these different drawings, representations of the Hitler bug, made with international scientific illustrators. So I wanted to kind of reverse the rules of the game. So I worked with the scientific illustrators from biospeleology, and I just gave them the name. So I was intrigued in the fact of, if it's the name that causes the extinction, how do they think that the beetle looks like? And then, as a kind of end of the entire project, we had performers inhabiting the space, and they were assuming positions of gallery attendants, installers, putting the paintings up, reading the catalogs, so really inhabiting the form and using its sort of the behavioral methods of the entire architectural display. And after the Venice project, I wanted to look further into these ideas of sort of local specific icons. So the Venice project was playing with extreme local specifics and somehow managed to cancel them out to point to universal values and questions. And I really wanted to look more toward rhetoric as well. So not only the form and the design, but the words themselves and how they also obfuscate and decorate. So I started reading Karl Kraus and his ideas around Spielraum. So Spielraum is a word which is quite an interesting word. It's slippery in translation. So it means boundary, but also it means room to play. Karl Kraus was a contemporary of Adolf Loos. So as Loos was arguing against decoration in design, Kraus was doing that also in language. And I ended up using Spielraum as a lens through which to examine soft power. But also, I wanted to focus on a specific search for a new aesthetic language that was surrounding the 1961 inauguration of the non-aligned movement. And I was particularly interested in looking at the city of Belgrade and how the tactics of the government were implemented in looking for the artists, the aesthetics, the architects that were to represent this city to the international audience and announce fundamentally the beginning of a new third way. And Spielraum had 3 chapters. I wanted to look at the birth of a new aesthetic language that has to endorse a new ideology. I wanted to look at this running space, and I wanted to look at its death, what happens when it no longer functions or when the client disappears. And the entirety of the Spielraum project used for its aesthetic formal background the designs that I drew from the archive of Yugoslavia surrounding these presentations in the city. So none of these objects were realized. So they were sort of flag carriers, flower pots, fire fountains, water fountains, and obviously for lack of money, they ended up making only flagpoles. But it's this amazing vocabulary, if you want, of the idea of how does one kind of come up with a new language, with a new alphabet. So these elements effectively became the language of the project. So the first chapter was titled "The Nation Loves It," and it took place in the Museum Ludwig, Budapest. So this was the time where also Hungary had kind of reshuffle of all the directors of all the cultural institutions by the president, where all sort of new right-wing directors were put online. So this meant that loads of curators left their positions, and Ludwig Museum was one of them. So we inaugurated "The Nation Loves It." Nobody came to the show.
In any case, it's always exciting. Either way, it's always thrilling to be in at the start of a new development. It's always thrilling to be in at the start of a new development. And we are here to mark the first steps of one of the most ambitious building programs and one of the most significant building programs. One of the largest building programs that we've had in our city, that we have made possible in our city. And I'm very glad. I'm very thrilled. I'm very thrilled. I'm proud. I'm proud to be here for the breaking of the ground.
So this script is a collaboration with Tim Etchells from Force Entertainment, and I wanted to look at the starting speeches, so the laying of foundation stones by various politicians through time. So this is a fictitious inaugural address, but it's drawn from various politicians that were all extremely involved in urbanist plans and sort of reconstitution of the urbanist landscape. So we have Khrushchev, we have Thatcher, we have Mitterrand, and so on. And the script was made with, utilizing the similar words, but only changing the tonality of it. And the entire exhibition at Ludwig became a film set for the next project. So all the artworks presented became backdrops. So the play kind of went back on itself. And this idea of the play with the alphabet kind of manifested itself in kind of more material form. So the curtain you see here is drawn from tapestries that are still hanging in the former Palace of Federation in Belgrade, which was the building that was the central host for the first conference of the Non-Aligned. And this tapestry is titled The Bosnian Forest. And only because of its name, it was so hated by the Serbian politicians that they did not want to use these salons anymore. So I will return to this later, but this notion of representation, even if it's completely abstracted, but of this national belonging, and how it then obfuscates the new ensuing ideologies was quite fundamental in the project. And the entirety of the Ludwig Museum was then populated with these performances where actors and dancers were activating these objects and sets. And rhetorics came back in the form of sculptures. And I tend to work with ironmongery quite a lot and bring political phrases back into sort of iron form. And I usually work with craftsmen who work on grates for parliament buildings, but instead of the grates that keep the people out, they manifest the words of the politicians that are on the inside of these places. Now, the second chapter of Spielraum was titled Give Expression to Common Desires, which is drawn from a Harry Truman speech for the laying of the cornerstone of the United Nations building in 1947. And this chapter focused on the functioning of this room to maneuver, this idea of Spielraum, and how then the language, the visual language that has been enacted, functions and plays with itself and the audience. For the last chapter of Spielraum, I wanted to look at death. So here you can see the exterior of the former Palace of Federation, which is an extraordinary building, not just for what it is, but for its history. So it was constructed between 1947 and 61. It took an awful long time. Obviously, Yugoslavia was completely bankrupt after the war. But also another thing was quite important. So Yugoslavia was following in step with the Soviets in terms of also the construction of the visual vocabulary. Now, with the Tito-Stalin split in 1948, Yugoslavia stays in this very strange kind of aesthetic vacuum, if you want. So it's facing the necessity of recreating its visual space. So here's just another sort of view. You can see what the building really looks like. So it's the front bit is where the salons of the republics are. So these are the salons that were named after the 6 republics, and they were all dressed in the specific republics, stone, wood, the specific artists, and so on. And obviously, because all these works were part of the fabric of the building after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, one could not just take the artworks and restitute them to the republics. So different formats had to be looked at. And this was quite a feat of engineering. So this was the main dome of the main meeting hall. And just to give you the flavor of this idea for the search of the new aesthetic space and representation that had to happen, I want to show you this. This is a state propaganda film which was made to celebrate the monument to the Red Army in Yugoslavia. And it was constructed and inaugurated in 1947. And this state propaganda film was never shown because of the Tito-Stalin split, which resulted in Yugoslavia's expulsion from the Communist Information Bureau. But it's just to give you like an idea of the aesthetics that Yugoslavia had to reinvent.
Ovako je izgledala drvena konstrukcija koja je bila podignuta na mjestu gdje se postavljao spomenik. Nakon lijevanja vade se dijelovi figura i odstranjuju se kanali po kojima je tekla bronza. Kad su svi radovi bili dovršeni, skela je skinuta. Nakon mnogih mjeseci rada u svojoj veličini ukazalo se vanredno umjetničko djelo majstora Augustinčića. 9. studenog 1947. na 3. godišnjicu slavnih bitaka koje su se odigrale na ovom prostoru, deseci hiljada ljudi iz Baranje i Slavonije, kao i drugih krajeva naše zemlje, došli su da proslave svečani čin otkrivanja spomenika. Crvena armija i naša armija, dvije slavne vojske prekaljene u okršajima protiv zajedničkog neprijatelja, stoje danas na braniku napretka, na braniku slobode i nezavisnosti naših naroda i cijelog čovječanstva. Mi pamtimo žrtve, mi cijenimo slobodu izvojevanu u krvi. Zajedno smo bili na bojnim poljima, zajedno smo danas na izgradnji mira.
So this is 1947, when this building is starting to be built. This is what it finishes like. So I wanted to revisit it and use it as a cinematographic device. And I wanted to populate it with a script of sole quotes that were drawn from politicians, activists, terrorists about the architecture of representation and its tearing down. Now, as you can imagine, the startup speeches are always well documented, well translated, but the tearing down, when something doesn't work, politicians get quiet. So it was a different type of research, trying to find these words. And they were kind of a complete negative of these positive affirmations that unify and create. So they were looking at enticements of demolition. And the other element I really wanted to revisit and address was the lack of the female presence from these nation-building discourses. And within this building itself, all the two-dimensional artworks are extremely avant-garde, abstract, but all single sculptural works are of female nudes, and actually quite highly eroticized female nudes. So I created a film which is titled Tear Down and Rebuild, and I recast the words of these white men as for women. And these are the positions of a pragmatist, a nation builder, a conservationist, and an artist. And just to give you an idea of the script is very fragmentary. It's created from only, it's just quotes, effectively, built together in different forms. Now also, the four figures within their political positioning exchange roles. So Thatcher sometimes is a nation builder, sometimes she's a pragmatist. Hitler is sometimes an artist and sometimes a pragmatist. So, you know, it's really kind of a research into the rhetorics and different usages of the same political position to achieve different ideas. And the film has a kind of classic tripartite structure where the viewer follows the scenography and the cinematography of the building itself. And here you can see just some more of the sculptures in the foyers. So effectively, every single one of them, yes, is a female nude.
It is self-explanatory that nations, as each and every historical event, fall under the law of change. Our city must gradually be built to fit into the following criteria: to benefit production, to benefit daily life, to enrich culture and civilization in a way that is tidy, clean, and beautiful.
But we are not against beauty, but against superfluities.
Faced with the lure of material goods and the seduction of power, cultural distinctiveness loses out and urban uniformity is imposed.
That which was beautiful yesterday is not beautiful anymore today, and that which is beautiful today will not be beautiful anymore tomorrow.
And the notion of this lack of female presence from nation-building discourse prompted my research into the most ideologically fragile world expositions of the 20th century. And I wanted to start with Barcelona, so 1929. And this was an expo effectively organized by the Spanish king to save his own image. So he wanted to really present a grandiose extravaganza of bread and circuses where the entire city would be filled with water, lit with light and so on. And I was intrigued by the story of almost this complete disappearance of the Yugoslav pavilion from the historical notes of these events. And the Barcelona Expo is mostly known today with the Mies Pavilion, the German pavilion, which won the first prize, the Grand Prix. And there is a legend that Yugoslavia's pavilion actually won this award, which is probably not true, but it really shows, what is at stake in these constructions. So I started to trace this, again, extremely lacking archive, going to the architect's birthplace, his museum, Yugoslav archives everywhere, and there was very, very little. So it became this notion of this kind of disappeared pavilion kind of started being quite an intriguing point of entry. So it had an amazing location. You see here a north photo of the location. And the brief for the architect, who was called Dragiša Brašovan, he was a Serbian architect, and the brief was a traditional Serbian peasant house. And one of the main themes that year was wood. And this is what he came up with. Star-shaped design with suggestions of a ship reference, which included the sculpture of another eroticized female nude of a land of plenty. Now, obviously, in 1921, each probably have not done that research, but I would imagine almost every pavilion did have a naked woman on some side or the other. So I really wanted to look into this notion of how architecture becomes a personification of state, and similar to the female figure of the mother nation in romantic or nation-building, nationalist painting, if you want. So here is a selection of them. Stately mother nations, loads of them representing states that don't exist anymore. And how architecture represents the state is very similar to how the female body represents the state. And another thing we kind of have to really take into account with expos is that always the envelope is the one which is forward-looking, a bit similar to sort of protocol government architecture. It's the outside, it's the facade that has to entice the viewer, it has to be forward-looking. But the interior, which is for the authority itself, is most traditional many times. And also within expos, it most of the times includes representations of ethnic kitsch. So when I was trying to trace the Brašovan pavilion, and so we're talking about 1928 and 9, obviously the Adolf Loos Baker House residency came to mind. So I was looking for architectural strategies that used similar design strategies to conceal and reveal, maybe from different reasons, but achieving quite a similar effect. And the Adolf Loos project is quite an interesting case study here, because also it had the role to represent desire, maybe not of a nation, but that of a highly eroticized female dancer, Josephine Baker. Now, the center of the house had a pool which was overlooked by, by a cafe, where spectators would be drinking coffee and being able to observe Josephine swimming naked, while she would not be able to see them. So this game, this display of voyeurism, was very similar to the structures that Brašovan was using. So as he framed the nation state, Loos framed the exotic dancer. So these ideas of building desire and architecture's complicitness in it became a point of study. Now, I was still not satisfied with all the sort of kind of lack of the archives. So I was really trying to piece together this building and figure out how these facade elements could meet. So I looked at Norman Wilkinson. So this is another case of a very similar tactic. And here this was a naval fleet camouflage that was supposed to break the idea of the size of the ship. Never really proved if it worked or not, but Again, it brings in the question of, of the power of the state and its representation, maybe in military, but same situation.
The pavilion had a striking facade, entirely covered in black and white horizontal stripes, spaced about 30 centimeters apart. An uncannily similar example of this decoration was found in a well-documented but unrealized project by the eminent architect Adolf Loos, designed a year prior to Brashevan's Yugoslav pavilion. Adolf Loos' plans were for the Parisian residence of Josephine Baker, the American-born dancer, singer, and black civil rights activist, also known as Black Pearl. Loos had an opulent space in mind for the Baker House interior. He planned for an indoor pool where its resident could swim whilst being observed by spectators drinking coffee in the overlooking bar. It had the makings of a peep show, housing desire for the spectator's pleasure.
So by bringing these three different architectural and design situations together, I really wanted to speak of these notions of building desire and also, again, of the lack of female body from the actual discourse. And this brought me to NADA, which was a project that looked at three sort of almost, you could say, star architects, or in retrograde star architects that became brands for their states. And I wanted to look at what happens to when architects are summoned and commissioned by the state to represent. And NADA in Croatian means hope, but in Spanish it means nothing. So this is also quite, I thought it was a really nice entry into the questions of what is at stake. And I created a 3-part exhibition and film project that looked at these various instances of the employment of modernism as a political tool in the 20th century, key 3 conflicts. So First, Second World War and the Cold War. So really looking at these spaces of aesthetic reappropriation and reignition. And the architects I addressed were Vjenceslav Richter, who's a Croatian architect who designed loads of trade fairs for Yugoslavia, culminating with the Expo in Brussels in 1958, Mies van der Rohe, who does not need introduction, and Arne Jacobsen. So despite the claims to kind of represent the universal values, the modernisms that NADA interrogated were utilized for specific ideological and nationalistic ends. And also these buildings that I was studying were kind of the ones that prompted the architects themselves to sort of get where they wanted to get in political terms. So they really played a double game within these projects. So this is Richter. This was his maquette for the Yugoslav pavilion in '58, which was unrealized. And the notion of why this was unrealized, I was really struggling with, whether it was a question of static or whether there was actual sort of political censorship. And going again through the archives in Belgrade, I did find the exchange between the Yugoslav ideologue, Edvard Kardel, who was saying that we cannot go to Brussels with this because it looks like a penis. And after Richter was censored, he was quite distraught, and he was obsessed with anti-gravity. So he created the sculpture you see in front of his realized pavilion that he titled Nada. And he made 3 nadas, and they were of different heights. So again, this notion of hope being of different heights was kind of a seminal drive of the project. So this is the pavilion realized, and this one did win the Grand Prix. And it was sold, and it's a school today, and it still exists, and it still has the name Yugoslavia on the facade. So I wanted to recreate the model for the pavilion as it was supposed to be, but I wanted to recreate it as a musical instrument. So in a way, as politicians played the architect and the design by committee, the musician here plays the building. And the violinist, Dejana Sekulic, she tunes the building according to the melodic signatures of a very specific work, and that is Miraculous Mentoring by Bela Bartok. And this was a ballet that was written in 1917, and it was always marred by state censorship from its conception onwards. So it was premiered in the Cologne Opera House in 1926, and it was outright banned by the mayor, who actually never saw it. And initially I thought it was because of the storyline. So the plot of the Miraculous Mentoring is the story of a prostitute and 3 pimps who use the prostitute to lure wealthy clients, until an exotic foreigner appears, who's the Mandarin, who does not want to die because he's miraculous. So it turns out that effectively the censorship happens because of the aesthetic language of the scenography. And this was the piece that Yugoslavia chose as a central part of the Richter Pavilion. Now, the traces of the ballet are again very sporadic. There's a few images that I managed to source. This is one of them. So it was actually a 1957 production from the Belgrade Opera House. And the scenography and the costumes were by Dusan Ristic, a painter. And I wanted to recreate the costumes and the choreography. Now, we only had about 12 photos to draw upon. Yugoslav television started 3 months after the Brussels Expo, so there were no video recordings. And for the lacking elements of the choreography, on which we worked with Lee Anderson, I decided to use, again, representation of the female body in nationalist painting. So this is an image of the Kosovo maiden, and all the elements that otherwise adore these paintings of swords and flags and so on became triangular and geometric structures that were drawn from the Ristic scenography. And it felt adequately conceptually relevant to restage this project within the framework of the European City of Culture, which is one of the, we could say, kind of logical inheritors of the ideas of cultural representations that Expo carried. So I filmed it within Arne Jacobsen's town hall, which also had a very similar structure to the actually original scenography in terms of the bridges and so on. And the movement where we were lacking was falsified with these sort of other sort of art historical references. And just a little note on the Jacobsen building. So it was constructed during the Nazi occupation of Denmark, and Jacobsen was Jewish, so he was left to finish it and then asked to leave. And as any other government building, this one also is filled with a number of artworks, one being this mural you can see at the end, which represents the life of mankind. Now, the painter did not want to dress the people on the painting so that it would not be dated. But if you're a woman in the mural, you can dance, you can sing, you can be a secretary, you can have children, you can want children, you can have had children. And the men are scientists and artists and politicians. So it's really incredible juxtaposition between the kind of contemporaneity of the, of the democratic space and of the representation and the datedness of it all. And this is just one of the stills from the film. So the project, the film itself, takes the choreography across the entirety of the building, again uses it as a cinematographic device. And the stain you see on the floor is where our Mandarin dies. Now, I recast the characters of the Bela Bartok ballet. So the prostitute becomes the mother nation, the 3 pimps are the 3 politicians, and the exotic foreigner is the architect. And the architect dies, and he dies on top of this stain, which is actually where the foundation stone of the building and its documents are buried. But it also points to an interesting space of this building, and that's the basement. So the mural on the right-hand side is from the basement. On the left side is from a space in the town hall where people can get married, and it represents on local Danish wood, it represents the local Danish flowers and the 4 seasons. The basement mural was done at the same time when Jacobsen was finishing the building, so during the Nazi occupation, by a Sunday painter who happened to be a sister of one of the radiographers, and it represents African women and children being bombed. This mural was restored about 12 years ago, and it's kept not on the eyes of the visitors. And the juxtaposition between these two, I think, illustrates extremely well the paradox of ideological history that burdens these protocolarian buildings and the question of what do we do with it. And the third act of Nada went to Mies. So I really wanted to look at his Krefeld projects, which were the projects that brought him toward the Barcelona pavilion. So effectively, through working for wealthy art collectors, he was endorsed as the one to represent. So these were the houses for Lange and for Esters, and they were effectively pavilions in their own right. They had to represent the wealthy man's art collection. And again, this is Barcelona 29, and the Spanish king opening extravaganza. Now there's, of course, nothing more research than this pavilion and Mies, but I was really intrigued in the words of the commissioners, the opening speeches, and effectively the sort of more personal debris that was kind of floating around these discussions. And there's just a small quote from the commissioner's speech at the opening in the Barcelona, in the German pavilion. And he said, "This building, the emblem of our exhibition, is born from our nation's spirit and mindset. It's an expression of self-confident calmness and stark clarity. It carries power, and with it, pure dignity. Rather than suspense, it depicts delight." And this is an interesting point to look at the form itself, the architectural form, and the politics behind it. So these are the three German pavilions from the three big expos of the 20th century. And just the notion of how after Mies comes Speer and then Eiermann, and Eiermann kind of repeats Mies, but Eiermann was a Nazi collaborator. So really kind of, we're really looking at these distinctions of when form completely obfuscates ideology. And again, I populated Mies with female presence. So the film I shot inside the Krefeld Villas had three characters, Germania, the artist, and the curator, who are reworking the idea of what to represent at the exhibition to entice the attention of the world audience. And their script is drawn entirely from found archives of the three big expos. And another play with the architecture and the grounds as a cinematographic device is happening here. So this is still from the film. And so, you here have the house by the male architect for the male client, but also the sculpture park that surrounds the house is filled only with sculpture by male artists. And Mies in architecture and its features are utilized as a cinematographic device throughout the film.
People of Europe, create for yourselves sacred possessions. Build.
Through this exhibition, we will achieve our destiny to be a shining city on a hill for all mankind to see.
So the women in Nada are allegories, sometimes singing, sometimes speaking, sometimes mute. They dance and decorate and question their own absence. And statecraft and soft power are great examples of illusionist tactics. And the best way to measure the power of an illusion is through the forensic lens of its failure. Dead ideologies and states tell us more about their conjuring mechanisms and tricks than their live counterparts.
Pour le public contemporain, l'une des meilleures études de cas de l'échec d'une illusion est l'ex-Yougoslavie, pays dont la dernière participation à une exposition universelle remonte à 1967 à Montréal. La signature historique de cette expo, intitulée Terre des Hommes, a été sa splendeur architecturale et sa quête d'unité nationale, toutes deux étant également caractéristiques du pouvoir de persuasion de la Yougoslavie.
So we are speaking about 1967, but this was effectively the last pavilion Yugoslavia ever had at an expo. And this is what originally it was supposed to look like. So this was another unrealized plan by Wenceslav Richter, who was, he was the architect who was always representing Yugoslavia at trade fairs and so on. So he was quite a seasoned architect in national representation. But rather than his design, the Yugoslav politicians, after quite rigorous debates, went for a design by a very young Serbian architect, Pesic, whose project basically destroyed his practice. So this was a project of 7 triangular structures, where 6 were representing individual republics and the 7th the host country. And here's just one of the excerpts from the political debates about what Yugoslavia should present. So this was a time where, you know, it was quite a fragmentary time for Yugoslavia. So the non-aligned movement was particularly under attack because of the sort of Israel and Egypt conflicts. So this idea of what do we represent? So the idea of choosing your own local artists, but the ones that have achieved high artistic values by using the national medium. And also this question, what is the national medium, is important. And the idea that they needed to have succeeded in ascribing to the national medium its global and universal value. And applied arts, of course, are tapestries, and they will add warmth to the exhibition. So this is drawn from the political meetings, from quite high up political meetings, and one can really trace the design by committee and how they really are curating tapestry with agriculture and industry and so on. And so there's just a few of the context sheets. Now, the pavilion is, again, the interior is really badly documented. But what I was quite interested in with this project that I worked specifically for the Montreal show on was the notion of curation, of national, but also of the Expo curation, where there were prescribed typographies, colors, and so on, and really looking at how sort of different countries then respond to that. Now, there was a large wave of nationalist sentiment surrounding the Yugoslav immigrants at that point. And what is extremely interesting, and what became kind of like a main carrier motive in my project, was this notion of the exchange of the architecture for the lack of the presence of the diplomacy. So Tito and the Yugoslav diplomacy did not travel to Montreal because they were advised against that because of potential terrorist attacks. So Tito was threatened. There were bombs at the embassies, consulates, Ottawa, Toronto. There was a dead pig paraded in a coffin with Tito's name written on it. There were big banner posters that were announcing Tito's strangulation in Montreal. So it was an extremely tense period. And as he did not appear, the pavilion was shot at, the windows were broken, the sculptures were mutilated. So just this idea of architecture effectively really becoming a personification for the kind of wish for destruction became seminal. So just one image from the interior, which was populated by very, very few women artists. A percentage was extremely low, and all the women that were present were lovers or wives of the man in power. And this was then the story of where the pavilion ended. It was, according to legend, donated, but it was effectively bought by Grand Bank in Newfoundland, and it became a maritime museum. And it's, again, a really interesting example of the disappeared object of national desire.
Ce modèle réduit du pavillon de la Yougoslavie représente une forme moderniste. Conçue par un comité, elle se compose de 7 structures monochromes triangulaires. Ces dernières symbolisent les 6 républiques yougoslaves ainsi que le pays hôte. Le gouvernement a laissé tomber son projet initial qui s'intéressait à la rhétorique idéologique et s'est plutôt tourné vers un programme fait de couleurs et de sons, privilégiant l'art du spectacle, le prestige et le théâtre. Les commissaires avaient reçu l'ordre de penser surtout aux ménagères et aux enfants qui auraient besoin de trouver des points d'intérêt dans les présentations. Des pierres et du bois du pays, accompagnés de danses et de chants nationaux, peuplaient cette structure moderniste qui illustrait les 6 républiques. L'année 1967 a vu les débuts de la dissolution de la Yougoslavie, elle-même préfigurée par une série d'attaques physiques au pavillon. Au moment où les républiques individuelles se sont séparées, dans les années 90, leurs actes de disparition individuelle se sont faits de plus en plus violents. Mais, comme dans tout bon tour de magie, une disparition peut conserver une illusion de pouvoir. La mort d'un État-nation doit d'abord établir une atmosphère dans laquelle sa disparition semble plausible. En mettant l'exagération et la manipulation au service du spectacle patriarcal, le magicien peut facilement obtenir l'attention désirée de l'auditoire international qui, toujours, devrait être laissé sur sa faim.
Following the discussions of the Yugoslav politicians that happened actually quite quickly for the Montreal Expo in about 3 months, one can really follow the words that announce very grandiose statements of what the country should present to effectively saying that Montreal is not in Europe and the North American audiences will not be able to follow discourse which is conceptual, and that they need to choose song and dance and color to entice the audiences. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Jasmina. That was, I mean, really get a sense of how deep, you go with research, and it's always fascinating to sort of find out where the starting point is, because it all seems like there's a lot of tectonic plates shifting when you first get, a kind of glimpse of an idea, but then it's like, okay, where do I start this research? And then the fact that so many of these archives that you're looking for are buried or hidden or in someone's basement, and you really have to dig deep. Anyway, it's a fascinating process that you go through, and it's one that's also really invested with collaboration. I mean, because you do so many, you're so interdisciplinary. I'm going to just start with my own question. Then we're going to do a question and answer, and I'll just sort of break the ice, but then I'm going to look around and field some questions. We'll take some questions for Jasmina. And is there a mic walking around? Yeah, okay, so Victoria, thanks. So tell me about how you select your collaborators, how you curate your collaborators in a sense.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, it's, of course, these projects are extremely large collaborative works, and they function like readers themselves, and we then aim to have effective readers, proper publications where we then can give the space to the theoreticians, curators, writers, other artists that have worked on these projects. But it's mostly, the core team is now about 5 people that we work with together, And it's, you're right, it's quite a sort of tight game we're playing with, because there is an extreme lack of potentiality of access. Also, the buildings that I tend to film in are of difficult access. Sometimes they're still live government buildings where it's extremely difficult to get close to. Sometimes they are art institutions where it's paradoxically even harder to work, but of kind of specific listed characters. So because the projects effectively really want to utilize that space and adorn that space, they have to play also a game with it. And I would say also with the collaborators, it's the same thing. I really approach people, or ended up working with people for their also sort of kind of conceptual, historical interests and medium. So I would work, for example, with an ironmonger from a village that has for decades worked on government architecture, or for example now with the kilim rugs, I was trying to find the villages where the same producers would be still present, that were fine-tuning the sort of the nationalist ideas surrounding a particular part of that craft.
I was wondering if you could share this little anecdote with us about trying to get any information about the Montreal pavilion, the Yugoslavian pavilion at Expo 67, because that turned out to be really a real challenge.
I mean, it was a funny one, because so the archive, most of the archives are in the Archive Yugoslavia in Belgrade, but because of, and this is also what I really wanted to play with in this project that we're now opening tomorrow, is this idea of what happens, when we're entering potentialities of geopolitical exoticism, and when artistic practices are effectively interesting just because of what they're referencing, and especially with the Yugoslav modernist shows and MoMA and so on, there is this like kind of almost like folklorization of the subject matter. And then, kind of going back to the archive, when we were looking for the material, so I work with Jelica Jovanovic mostly, who was also one of the researchers for the MoMA show. And, she effectively holds the key in a way that she really knows all the research, all the archive ladies and so on, because already that is very difficult. But we were really struggling, because first they did not even find the notebook where the list of what is in which box was. And then, of course, according to the rules, you get only the 4 boxes. So it really took us, it took us like good 6 months to get the materials. And then, you get the archive, you have no idea what's in it, and it's all referencing photos. There's no photos. And I was trying to find the photos of the interior, and there were none anywhere. And we finally found a photographer in Zagreb. And this is now another problem with the archives, specifically this sort of this region and this thematic, because of the MoMA shows, and
people know about the MoMA show, right? Sorry to interrupt. The big Yugoslavian architecture show at MoMA that opened in July, right? So so go on. Sorry.
So Toward the Concrete Utopia, MoMA, which is an incredible exhibition. I think they've done a really, really great job. But now people who own the archives, they think the archives are really valuable. So we also had a case that, so an amazing archive in Skopje, which was bought by some investor, and it just happened that some archives were left in that building, and then that fire mysteriously happened. And then again, is this whole thing, whether did he think he would get insurance money for that? So it's really difficult, and also how people are now behaving with the archives that they hold. And what we are really effectively trying to do, so I work also with Vladimir Kulic a lot, Jelica, Sanja Horvatincic. So these are all very young researchers. Marija, who was also very seminal on the unfinished modernizations. And we really are trying to document and create sort of a shared access Dropbox, of this situation, because you have, also you still have a few of the artists and architects that are still alive, like Živković, who we worked with directly. He's 92 now. And we managed to scan his personal archive and then shared it across. So it's a difficult one. And then also, especially with the archive in Belgrade, the archive of Yugoslavia, things go missing. You know, you kind of have researchers coming in, things just go missing, nothing is digitized. The Wenceslav Richter archive in Zagreb, so it's his private residence, which is run by the museum. So I was talking to Vesna Meštrić, who is the curator of that exhibition, and you know, she was saying that it was like really a lot of things just disappeared because they don't, you know, they don't have they don't have money effectively, they don't have the manpower. So it's a really, and it's also an important thing to do properly and ethically, because you know there's been so much of the work now surrounding, especially modernist architecture in Yugoslavia, that I personally feel that there needs to be also, you know, a proposition of different ways of working.
So through your artwork, you're effectively daylighting all of this archival. You're doing a lot of this archival work with your collaborators, and hopefully that's being preserved in some way. It ends up coming out through your artwork, actually.
The biggest win, in my opinion, was that we managed to get certain documents to get numbers in the archives because we published them, so they had to give them numbers. But you know,
Well done.
I mean, you know, it's just an artistic practice, you know, but it's what I am trying to do is really kind of create a platform for discussion where, you know, things are maybe also brought out to multidisciplinary discourse and interaction. And, you know, really this idea of, I won't say performing the archive, but, you know, really expanding it and, you know, also making it as a useful tool for knowledge, for contemporaneity.
All right, so let's open it up then to questions from us out here. I'm looking around. Yes, yeah, right over here.
Bonsoir. Alors, je vous félicite grandement de présentation avec une petite remarque. Vous avez dans l'ensemble présenté, vous pouvez le compléter, ce n'est jamais trop tard, vous allez continuer probablement d'exposer votre conférence. À mon avis, la meilleure symbiose de l'architecture et de la nature, à jamais, c'était le projet de l'hôtel à Podgorica de Kana Radovic. C'est dommage que vous ne l'avez pas présenté en parlant tellement de Yougoslavie. Et ça, c'est une remarque. Une deuxième, toujours en complément de ce que vous avez parfaitement fait à ce jour, c'est la plasticité des volumes sculpturaux de certains monuments yougoslaves en Yougoslavie, en Soutieska, etc., qui peuvent inspirer, j'espère bien, avec le fonctionnement correspondant, tous les jeunes architectes encore très longtemps. Bon. Je vous verrai plus tard si c'est possible. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. I'll try and resume, but
I'm
it's
very
going to
sorry,
be a
my
little
French
tricky.
is not existent. I'm very sorry.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer de traduire votre commentaire le meilleur possible, mais c'est sûr que je vais rater le nom de l'architecture que vous citez. Donc, je vais essayer juste de résumer, et puis peut-être si on aura besoin des précisions, vous pouvez les donner. So he sort of congratulates you for the project, for the talk. He was citing a few architectures by Yugoslavian architects here in Montreal that were not part, that you're not focusing on, that sort of capture this symbiosis of form and I guess statement. J'ai pas capté les noms des architectes que vous avez cités ou le nom
d'architecte, c'est
Kana Radovic. Ok. Avec la nature, with nature, symbiosis of nature. Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, we learn something. We learn, you know, in these processes, it gives us the opportunity to think about all of these other architects and other, you know, works that come.
But
that
what
are
I
in the
would
city.
say is the architecture in particular, I think, is very interesting in former Yugoslavia because it was there was a very, very big exchange. So Le Corbusier had the biggest number, apparently, of foreign architects in his atelier were Yugoslavs. So, you know, when you know, people think of Yugoslavia, a lot of the times, you know, they think of, you know, something which was very closed, that the borders were closed, there was no exchange. But especially, I would say architecture, even more than art, was extremely hand in hand with, you know, the world developments. Especially with the Expo, the Richter architecture at Expos, one can really see how sort of, you know, in hand it was with more global developments.
Another question? Yes.
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I really, really look forward to seeing the show tomorrow. It's a fascinating research, obviously, but what I find maybe even more fascinating is your aesthetic choices as an artist. And so I think, like, you've shown very convincingly how soft power works within those architectures of nation and construction of this national identity. But I wonder if you'd be willing to comment a little bit on, if you allow me to say it like that, on the soft power of your own artwork.
Thank you very much. And yeah, brilliant point and question. And it's precisely, you know, this is the idea. You know, the practice really wants to play the double game and also, you know, be aware and problematize how complicit we are as cultural producers in feeding back, you know, to the cultural capital, political capital. Now, coming from Slovenia, we don't have an art system, really. We don't have an art market. So the sort of art system is effectively still in the socialist form. So artists would get funding only from the state. So if you would do something, or like if you would piss off the ministers at the Ministry of Culture, you would not get your grant. You would not get shows, and if you don't get the shows, you don't collect your points, which you need for the government to pay your pension plan. So it's a very archaic system, and it's extremely interesting that it still exists. And I always thought it would take only one generation, and I think I was wrong, unfortunately. So we still are stuck in that bubble. So, you know, this kind of permutation that, you know, we are actually in an extremely, you know, obviously contemporary moment, you know, European Union, but you really still see these structures. And of course, you know, the government funding structures, they're in place everywhere. You know, I mean, I live in London, and, you know, whenever you make a project and you kind of, you know, apply to Arts Council and you have to tick the boxes, and we've all been there. We all know how this works. But it is this idea of, like, kind of, you know, bringing that into interplay. So, as I mentioned before, you know, one of the, for example, with the Slovenian pavilion, one of the main kind of goals or like interests really was to see if we could get the Slovene cultural kind of diplomatic core engaged in an actual dialogue, and by, you know, the kind of the parliament really kind of debating the aesthetic sort of and the conceptual choices we were making. You know, we felt we came as close as we could. And yes, you know, the aesthetic language I use is very, you know, it's very highly focused. It's extremely tight, and it really wants to push to almost like the screaming point to really kind of push forward the absurdity of it all, you know, and kind of like also using these words of the politicians and reenacting them in a style of, and also the language, because, you know, it's a kind of aesthetics and language here are the ones that are, you know, they're obviously obvious particular choices, but, you know, like also using, you know, RP in terms of, you know, British English, and using structures which are kind of imitating kind of historical drama, or also, you know, questioning how the medium lies, how the medium is creating the illusion, and also, you know, who has the authority to guarantee the presentation. So aesthetic here is just a part of this game of the theater of the absurd.
Is there one last burning question out there? I would like to thank Jasmina Cibic for her generosity in giving us this wonderful lecture tonight. I want to thank the CCA, merci, Centre canadien d'architecture, toute l'équipe ici. C'était vraiment un grand plaisir de travailler avec vous. Thank you so much to our wonderful colleagues at DHC Art, Victoria Carrasco and Dahlia Chang. I want to congratulate also DHC Art's team who are, tweaking and doing the last little touches on the show, which opens tomorrow evening at 5:30 p.m. Please come. I want to mention just a shout out to Mansa Bajak and Pete Moss, who didn't know he was going to be a technician in the show and has gracefully stepped in. Thanks to all our guests too who came from out of town. It was really lovely to have such a great representation here to support Jasmina. Merci à vous tous d'être parmi nous ce soir et à très bientôt. Peut-être une autre présentation de ces jours. Merci et bonne soirée.